America had been very close to war, but we are not brought into it until Japanese aggression attacks us. Now remember, this had been going on for a while, sort of as a result of Japanese success in the Russo-Japanese War. In response to Japanese aggression, especially in China and Korea, we, excuse me, we embargo Japanese trade, which limits their access to war. Japan needs this oil, and there's no way they can wage war without it. So Japan decides to attack us in a very bold move at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The Japanese Navy had sailed under almost radio silence across half of the Pacific in order to get within about 300 miles of Hawaii. And at 7:49 a.m. on December 7th, the Japanese admiral calls Tora, Tora, Tora. Now, Tora in Japanese does mean tiger, but the admiral wasn't saying tiger, tiger, tiger. It was a shortening or an abbreviation of the words that meant lightning attack. In this attack, Japan is really targeting what was called Battleship Row in the harbor. The USS Arizona is the most famous battleship that was destroyed, and here you can see when that ship is hit by the Japanese bomb. In total, we have about 2,400 Americans killed, about 1,200 wounded. We lose 14 different ships, and this was a large part of the American Navy. Japan loses very few men, only 90 men. They do lose 29 planes, but this is out of hundreds, and they lose 5 midget submarines that had been launching torpedoes. America's not going to let this stand. We're not going to just sit back and do nothing. So almost immediately, a raid is planned. This is known as the Doolittle Raid. And this was going to happen in April of 1942. We knew that it was unlikely to make a huge difference in the war effort. It was mostly a morale boost. The goal of the raid was to bomb Tokyo and then continue on and land in China. But the bombers were forced to take off earlier than they had planned because they had been spotted by the Japanese Navy. This was really an incredible feat because these massive bomber planes were not intended to take off from battleship or destroyer runways. The planes do fly over Tokyo. They are able to unload their bombs, but not all of them make it back safely. We watch the clip from the movie Pearl Harbor. Not only does this bring us into war, but it has a huge effect on civilians in America, on Japanese Americans in particular. Now, the Rose Parade and the Rose Bowl, which always take place on New Year's Day in Pasadena, on New Year's Day 1942, it was moved at the last minute to New Jersey because there was a deep fear that there would be additional attacks on the West Coast. And a little bit of this fear had to do with the Issei and the Nisei. Issei are first generation Japanese in America, those who had immigrated to America, and they had set up businesses often having to do with agriculture and farming, and a very tight-knit community. The Nisei are their children. So these are second-generation Americans. They were born in America, and they are sort of what we would call today two-culture kids, that they are living in two different cultures. They live in America, they are American citizens, but they also are still deeply rooted in that Japanese culture. And the American government was afraid that Japanese Americans would give their allegiance to the emperor, because this is what the emperor had called for. So the Executive Order 9066 calls for the internment of Japanese Americans. Almost 2/3 of these people are already American citizens. There are a few people of Italian and German heritage that end up being interned for a short amount of time, but this is mostly about the Japanese. And the reason is we feared that these Japanese Americans would be spies for Japan and that they would work as what we would call a fifth column within American society to help the Japanese war effort. It excludes Japanese people in America from regular elements of life. And I told you guys about the case of my grandmother, Shirley, who was Irish, doesn't have a drop of Japanese blood in her, but she has these squinty, smiley eyes, and she had dark, dark hair. And many people had asked her if she was Asian. Now, at the time, she was living in San Diego on the West Coast because her husband, Bill, had gotten a job with the Marines at the training depot in San Diego. When the internment begins, she told people that she was Filipino because she didn't want them thinking she was Japanese because she might be treated poorly. People treated other American citizens as second class, as other than. In late spring of 1942, these Japanese Americans are sent to various internment camps that are set up across the western part of the states. And this is really because the majority of the Japanese population in America was in these western states. There are only a very small number on the East Coast. These internment camps, they would live in barracks. They were not sturdily built. They were pretty much wood frame buildings with tar paper walls, which is kind of like heavy duty construction paper. The most famous camp, at least in California, is Manzanar. If you've ever driven up to Mammoth, you will have seen this off to the left side of your car on your way up to Mammoth. And Manzanar still stands. It is now a memorial and a museum. And these American citizens are kept under guard for the duration of the war. There could be as many as 18,000 people living in one camp. They could do jobs, they could earn money, but this is an absolutely abominable way to treat fellow American citizens. But again, you have to remember, the American government thought, well, they are a threat. They, them, the other. Manzanar is still very important because it is the best kept camp. They've got a great museum there. They have sort of reconstructed some of these barracks buildings. Now, one Japanese American, Fred Korematsu, he decided he was not going to be interred. So he refused to be taken. He is eventually arrested, and his family is put into one of the camps. And the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, asked Fred Korematsu if he would like to be a test case to challenge the legality of, is this okay to intern American citizens? He was found guilty of evading internment, which was against the law, and he was placed on probation. But other than that, he didn't receive any punishment. Finally, in 1983, this decision is overturned by the Supreme Court. And then later, in 1988, President Reagan signed into law payment to any survivors left from the camps that they would get about $20,000 each. Now, while that is good, that while there have been steps made to sort of apologize, it still is kind of scary that it even happened in the first place. And here's a Dr. Seuss cartoon talking about that fifth column that many Americans feared, that just because someone was of Japanese ancestry, that they would be loyal to Japan rather than America. Now, in terms of Europe, we've got another Seuss cartoon here, that in a sense, America thought maybe it could be safe, but all of these other countries have fallen. Norway and Poland and France and Britain is under attack. We can't be the only ones left. What had been the New Deal and the production of trying to repair the economy in the New Deal becomes all about winning the war. Many people had called FDR Dr. New Deal, and now they call him Dr. Win the War. There is a huge mobilization effort to get ready for war. During the Depression, unemployment had hovered around 25%. That changes drastically because of the war. And so his former domestic programs are no longer at the forefront of his policy. FDR is focused on the war. And that will rely on Americans getting into the factories, Americans helping the country prepare for war. Some people were critical and wondered why hadn't this sort of mobilization happened during the New Deal to relieve some of that suffering. Now, war had changed a bit because technology had changed a bit since the First World War, so there are new industries. One great example of that is the Higgins boat. This is a family company out of New Orleans, and these boats become essential for transporting tanks. Tanks were only introduced in the First World War. Now, in the Second World War, we already know they're going to be important. Also, things like radar and sonar are going to be very important. Even in the medical field, the medicines that soldiers will need, because we're going to be fighting the Japanese, which will be in a more tropical jungle type of climate. So, for instance, atabrine was a malaria medicine that soldiers were forced to take in the Pacific Theater. Another industry is going to be specifically the weapons industry. And the Manhattan Project is the name for the project that creates the atomic bomb. Its original starters are Albert Einstein and Enrico Fermi, both who had left Europe to escape fascism. Of course, Einstein was a German Jew, and Fermi was an Italian who had a Jewish wife. So they had both come to America and had warned that the Germans were trying to develop some sort of nuclear fission weapon. There are facilities around the country in order to produce the materials necessary, and it will all be assembled in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in the middle of nowhere. And the test bomb that they assemble is known as the Gadget. And the guy who runs this whole project, the project manager, is named Robert Oppenheimer. And we looked at the video of him in class where he talked about the quote from the Bhagavad Gita. The project manager for all of this is Robert Oppenheimer. And we watched the video of him in class discussing his thoughts when this test bomb went off in 1944. And he thought of the Hindu scriptures and the god Vishnu, who said, "I am death, destroyer of worlds," and that he realized he was doing this for a war effort, but he had created, and the project had created, something horrific.